From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Sarah Lancaster will discuss fall-applied herbicides for winter annual weed control in fields which would be planted to corn or grain sorghum next spring. She'll talk about how the fall treatment sets the stage for effective overall control and which herbicide choices best fit this strategy. Then from the IGP Institute here at K-State, Guy Allen takes a closer look at the rising cost of ocean freight as a contributing factor to major grain shipment issues around the world and how those are weighing on the grain markets. And later this week's horticulture segment, where K-State's Charlie Barden talks about planting landscape ornamental trees in the fall. All that here on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to the Thursday edition of Agriculture Today. Glad to have you aboard once more. And for you row crop producers, time to start thinking to the next growing season, even though the combines and the grain carts are still very much on duty for the better percentage of you growers. And to the weed control program you will likely launch for your corn and sorghum even this early in the fall. Some ideas on that first application of herbicide on that ground to be planted to either of those crops. Sarah Lancaster has joined us once more, weed management specialist, K-State Research and Extension. We're talking about doing something about, Sarah, winter annual weeds with a fall application. This is recommended practice, you say.
Eric, it's an important practice. It may not be one that generates an immediate economic return for farmers, but it is something that definitely can make the spring go smoother and go faster and help us with our weed management concerns at planting.
The idea here is a two-pronged application, an early jump on those weeds, and that'll make success with controlling them in the spring much more likely.
That's right, Eric. We're not talking about moving your spring applications to the fall. We're talking about situations where it could be advantageous to add a fall application to keep down the growth of those winter annuals and make those at planting or early pre-emergence applications in the spring more effective.
Then what weeds is one going after here? And there's quite a list, actually.
Depending on your field, there could be quite a list. Some things I've seen coming up in fields already are things like henbit, chickweed, some of the mustards. Henbit and chickweed we don't really think about as being particularly competitive with our crops because they've usually kind of done their thing by the time row crops are being planted and coming up. But they can cause problems. They can harbor diseases and nematodes, and they can prevent things from drying out in the spring to allow timely planting. We can also think about species like some of the brome species. Anything that's going to be coming up here as the soil temperatures cool off in the fall and that would still be present in the spring. There are a couple of species that we can sort of target here, though, that can be pretty important. One is kochia. There's a little bit of work out of Hayes that suggests that maybe we can get some kochia suppression out of our fall applied application. But the one that I think folks should be most concerned about is mare's tail or horseweed. And I think we'll talk about that some more here in just a minute.
We want to devote extra time to that one because it can be challenging, to be sure. The herbicide choices here, of course, that will be weed dependent by and large, but are there general ways to go here?
Generally, Eric, I would tell you that the go-tos are glyphosate and 2,4-D, but I don't know if you've priced a gallon of glyphosate product lately.
It's higher.
It's higher and anticipated to be pretty hard to come by spring, by the time spring rolls around. So, if I'm a producer, I'm thinking about saving that glyphosate for when I really need it in season. So, potentially if you were worried about grass control, you might be looking at a Group 1 herbicide like Select or maybe Assure or something of that nature. 2,4-D, some formulations are even predicted to be a little bit potentially tight next spring. So maybe we're trying to shift away from that a little bit with some of these burn down applications potentially. If we think about replacing glyphosate, though, in terms of a non-selective product, right, like glyphosate's really good on grasses, but it's also non-selective. Some things to think about might be paraquat. Supply issues, haven't heard of any supply issues with paraquat. Sharpen could be a little higher price point, but it would be non-selective control with just a little bit of residual activity. And then one other product that we should probably talk about in this space is a new product called Reviton. The active ingredient in Reviton is TF-inostil. It's a chemical cousin to the active ingredient in Sharpen. So it's going to have fairly similar activity. I have not had a lot of looks at it in the field. Some would say that it is a little bit better on grasses than Sharpen. And the other big difference is Sharpen does have a little bit of residual activity, whereas the Reviton will not have any residual activity really to speak of. So just another product that might be in the marketplace as we think about, options and comparing what we can get a hold of this fall.
But you hit upon something there. How much attention should be paid to the residual capacity of whatever application one chooses here?
Eric, I would argue that is probably the key component of this application, is that residual activity. So you're going to put that herbicide out there. It will get activated here this fall. But then all of the forces that cause that herbicide to break down are basically going to shut down in the wintertime, right? So you do still have a little bit out there pending torrential precipitation this winter, which is not in the forecast. You will still have some residual activity out there. So, things like Valor, flumioxazin is a pretty cost-effective option here, depending on what crop you're going to. Maybe sulfentrazone products are an option. And then some of the ALS inhibiting products, things like maybe Classic or Autumn Supers are sometimes used for that residual activity there.
Haven't mentioned the other caveat, and that is resistance to given herbicides and what needs to be thought about there, again, dependent upon what product route you're going with here. But what comes to mind immediately on that score?
Oh, man, when we talk about herbicide resistance, anytime you mention an ALS inhibiting herbicide, almost the next words out of my mouth are usually if you have susceptible populations. Right. So especially as we think about things like the mare's tail that have known resistance to those group 2 herbicides, you might get some mileage out of them for some things, but you got to know what you're targeting and what your population is like.
Let's talk specifically about mare's tail. It seems to be one of the more problematic weeds to get on top of here in the fall and then in the spring. Why is it so challenging? It's resistance factor, what?
So it does have some herbicide resistance that we know about, ALS resistance, glyphosate resistance. In other parts of the country, there are some other herbicide resistances. But really, one of the big problems with mare's tail is that once it reaches a certain size, a lot of times we talk about like a 4-inch diameter rosette. Certainly, once we get to spring and that plant starts to bolt or those internodes, that stem starts to elongate, it just becomes really difficult to control chemically, no matter what chemical you're throwing at it. Getting something effective down in the fall can help control those fall emerging plants before they have a chance to really get large and established. If you put something with some residual down, Valor might be something good for this. You can prevent future flushes in the fall. And so then when you get to spring, you just have those spring emerging weeds to deal with in your burn down application. So
you would really emphasize the residual aspect here with mare's tail.
Yeah, I think if you're in a situation where you have a mare's tail issue, I think that is a place where I would think really hard about looking at a fall applied program with some residual activity to target that mare's tail. Some of our group 4 products can be good on mare's tail. And that could come into play either in the fall or in the spring. Other products that can be good on mare's tail would be glufosinate-containing products or Liberty, but the big caveat there is, again, going back to those potential supply concerns. Liberty, in all likelihood, is going to be very tight this summer. Mare's tail is a plant that generally needs 2 passes of Liberty to control bolted mare's tail, and I would not want to count on being able to get the product for that second pass if I were a producer.
There are other cultural means of dealing with weeds, such as mare's tail, though we can slip that in. If one is in a desperate situation, they might want to go with the full tillage route.
Yeah, we talk about mare's tail and glyphosate and the increased adoption of no-till, like all in the same breath when you're a weed scientist, right? They all kind of came together. So, Tillage is a good option for controlling these small-seeded plants that you can just bury that seed and then it's not able to germinate. Another non-chemical option that we can think about, Eric, is cover crops. Mare's tail is actually a really good species to target with fall-applied cover crops. The best case situation would have been to have had that cereal rye or some winter cereal-based mix planted, and then this nice little 1.5 inches of rain that we had here in Manhattan this week. You should get some really good growth of that cover crop to then suppress that mare's tail, right? Because the whole thing with cover crops is getting enough biomass to outcompete the weeds that are there. And just because of the life cycle and the biology of mare's tail, it really lends itself to being suppressed by fall-seeded cover crops.
There may be a tiny window of opportunity yet, though, if that mare's tail isn't that far along. Right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Main thing, though, as one maps out a strategy against these winter annual weeds, well, one needs to be putting this together pretty quickly and thinking in terms of these fall applications. That needs to happen relatively soon.
Absolutely. Once the ground freezes, we don't want herbicides going out, which we're a ways away from that. But certainly, plants have to be actively growing to take up the herbicide. So if you're planning on applying a post-emergence product, you got to get it before those plants really start to harden off for the winter.
Yeah. Of course, reference the 2021 Chemical Weed Control Guide from K-State. It'll outline in full detail for you your alternatives for treating winter annual weeds on ground to be seeded to corn or grain sorghum this coming spring, with a fall application emphasized there. Sarah, thanks as always.
Thanks, Eric.
She's a weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Sarah Lancaster with us on this part of Agriculture Today, and we will return with more for you after this break over the K-State Radio Network. We are back now on Agriculture Today, and time aside for observations and insight on the international grain trade scene. We bring by every month Guy Allen. Guy is the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University and has a keen perspective on all of these matters. And before we talk about some of these intriguing developments in the international markets, what were your brief takeaways, Guy, from that USDA World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report this past Tuesday, as per our grain supply and demand situation?
Well, there were a few interesting numbers and a few surprises in Tuesday's USDA report. Corn and soybeans came in a bit bearish, wheat a bit supportive. Just to sort of highlight it from, an international point of view, the U.S. Corn production number came in about 66 million bushels above trade average expectations at just over 15 billion bushels. The USDA also raised U.S. exports slightly and the carry out as well, which that's going to hang on prices a bit. Keep in mind, historically, prices are still fairly high, but they've come off their recent contract highs in the last couple months, or I guess since May. Also, we're looking quite closely at the Black Sea crops as they come off and South American crops as they start to plant their summer crops in South America. Beans also, they increased production numbers on that, which increased world carry-out numbers by about 6 million metric tons, quite a bit higher than trade expectations. The biggest driver of that was an increase in U.S. crop to 4.45 billion bushels. That was 38 million bushels above the average trade estimate. Shifting to wheat, which was a bit more optimistic, wheat numbers came in with their ending stocks actually lowered. U.S. ending stocks down about 35 million bushels to 580 million bushels total. World stocks were also lowered by about 6 million metric tons, and that's down 11.2 million metric tons from a year ago. So the supply and demand situation for the wheat situation is continuing to tighten up a bit. In contrast a bit, Australia is coming in with another record production year down there, and we continue to watch Russian export tax policies and export policies as they drive exports out of that Black Sea situation.
Well, those are some indicators from that WASDE report, but taking a bit deeper dive into things aligned with those numbers, and you have been watching very closely what you described, Guy, as multi-year high levels in several commodities beyond our major grains, and we will tie all this together as we go along. But this is a key thing, you say.
Yeah, look, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen oats and palm oil make all-time highs over the last few weeks on a number of occasions. Just this week, oats is trading up at $6 and about 86 cents a bushel, which is an all-time high for oats. That's reflective of the short crop in Canada. Keep in mind that Chicago oat contract, it is deliverable, but it doesn't meet milling oat spec. It's basically a feed oat spec. Palm oil's sort of been in the headlines for a while, and it continues to make all-time highs. This week, trading up to $1,162 a metric ton for palm oil, as production challenges as well as demand particularly is driving palm oil to new highs, and that's being reflected through the whole oilseed complex. Also, interesting footnote, cotton is at a 10-year high, trading at $11.61 U.S. dollars a bale. That's a 10-year high, and that's going to make for interesting spring planting intentions as those commodities compete for acres. Also in there, we're seeing crude oil up to 7-year highs, trading above $82 a barrel for the WTI forward contracts on that. And probably most interesting from an export point of view is we're seeing ocean freight indexes, particularly for dry bulk ocean freight, reach a 13-year high. This goes back to just immediately prior to the global financial crisis in 2007 and 8. And we've seen ocean freight in double, if not triple, for most routes. And that definitely impacts our grain movements.
And that leads us to explore further the nuances of shipping commodities, such as our major grains. And you had some thoughts to share about what's happening on that front that will definitely resonate through the markets.
Yeah, I want to take a moment. Let's drill down into that dry bulk ocean freight situation a bit, Eric. We need to keep in mind that grain's not the only dry bulk commodity. As a matter of fact, the biggest two drivers of the dry bulk index are coal and more specifically iron ore. And it's the movement of those large bulk commodities that basically drives that ocean freight rate for us. Now, iron ore being the biggest component of that, one of your biggest buyers of iron ore is China. And as people begin to restock their inventories and they retool up post the COVID shutdown, a lot of people across a lot of items and inventories have been run down to a minimum, and they're trying to build those back up in this wake of surge in demand. Now, there's also a little trade dispute, not so little trade dispute at the moment, between China and Australia, and that's sort of highlighted in this South China Sea geopolitical situation, as well as Australians' reactions to the COVID and China's position in that with the World Health Organization. So not only have they slapped 80% tariff on Australia barley, but they're now not buying Australia coal and iron ore. China still needs the iron ore, so they've gone to the second largest exporter of iron ore into Brazil. Now, keep in mind, when you're moving a commodity such as iron ore from Australia to a largest port to China's largest import port, it's about 3,300 nautical miles. If we've got to shift that supply over to Brazil, that distance goes up to 10,800 nautical miles. So that's over 3 times the distance. And if you've got a finite number of ships moving dry bulk commodity around and you've extended their travel by threefold, you need significant additional capacity to import the same volume of iron ore. Now, that situation not only applies to iron ore, but also applies to coal. Australia is their largest supplier of coal. A lot of that demand in China has been shifted to Indonesia, but they've lost capacity. Now, what we've seen also in China is in the wake of tightening coal supplies, they've been shutting down their capacity to generate electricity. And in the wake of that, they've been shutting down a lot of industrial processes. An important component of that being their soybean crushing and processing plants.
And that has meaning for our sales.
But that has a very direct meaning for U.S. and Brazilian soybean exports. And if you shut down your crushing plants, you don't need to import soybeans. And usually from the 1st of September, you expect China to shift their buying from Brazil to the U.S. There was a bit of a hiccup in that with Hurricane Ida going through New Orleans. We've pretty much recovered capacity on that, and during that time they shifted some of their purchases to Brazil. But we just have not seen the same volume of Chinese interest in that soybean market from the 1st of September that we would have expected. I think a lot of that is due to the shutting down or the reduced capacity of crushing due to the power situation, due to their limitation on coal imports. And all of that's being driven, a very, very high price of commodities for coal, iron ore, for soybeans, for any bulk commodity around the world if you're importing it, because your freight rates have more than doubled. For instance, U.S. center Gulf to China is usually about low $40 a metric ton. 12 months ago, today it's over $80 a metric ton that they're paying for ocean freight. So all those things are interconnected. It's really frustrating, this whole supply chain situation, in very specific ways. And farmers today in Kansas are not only experiencing lower prices because of the higher ocean freight, they're also experiencing exceptionally high prices or even availability of things from fertilizer and chemical to tires for their equipment to the equipment itself.
Always important dynamics to be acquainted with as producers. And to that point, there will be a special event this coming weekend. And you, colleagues here at K-State, will be hosting this. It's the Commodity Tailgate, and it'll be at the IGP Center here on the campus, whereby there will be a grain economy forum. Tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, IGP, the International Grains Program, and the Kansas Grain Commissions of wheat, corn, grain, sorghum, and soybeans are hosting a tailgate party before the Iowa State game. At 3 o'clock, IGP is going to host a short outlook forum, about 50 minutes to an hour. And speakers of that will be Dr. Alan Featherstone. He's going to focus on sort of the macro events influencing markets such as interest rates, inflation, risk, and profit. And then Dan O'Brien and myself will have a bit of a conversation on a bit of the market situation and how different issues that are affecting today's supply chain and how that's impacting your farm gate prices. So I would encourage anyone to come along, whether you're a grain grower in Kansas, or we'd invite our Iowa State friends and neighbors as well as agribusiness people. Come by the IGP Center at 3 o'clock this Saturday and enjoy a bit of hospitality and listen to some views and news on the markets.
It'll be a great exchange. The IGP Center is just across the street from Bill Snyder Family Stadium, very close proximity to the game, which is later that evening. If you'd like to know more about this commodity tailgate and specifically this grain outlook forum that Guy just described, go to kscorn.com. You'll find more information there, the Kansas Corn website, kscorn.com. We'll see you there, Guy, and thank you for these comments right here.
Thank you, Eric.
He's Guy Allen, the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University, and we'll be back on Agriculture Today. Coming your way next on Agriculture Today, our weekly horticulture feature for you. And this is an optimum time, as many of you homeowners know, for planting new landscape ornamental material, and that would include trees. Over from the Horticulture and Natural Resources Department at K-State, Forester Charlie Barden. Charlie, right to it. You really endorse the idea of planting in the fall. Why so?
Yes, in the fall we get cooler temperatures, and you can water individual trees, give them the moisture they need, and they'll have several months to grow roots and get over the transplant shock on the site, and next spring they'll be ready to grow and be more successful.
It starts with species selection, and you had some thoughts on doing one's homework here, if you will.
Exactly. Many times homeowners want something that will color up nicely in the fall, so the ideal time to select that tree at the nursery is in October, when you can see what the true color will be. We've had several examples of folks buying a pair of trees they want to be color up nicely in the fall, and they buy them in April, and they plant the trees, and one colors up great in October, and the other stays green until frost, and it just really kind of ruins the plan they had.
You need to know what you're purchasing here. What are good resources to turn to study trees, study their characteristics, their traits?
Right. We have several fact sheets available at the Extension office or online that describes various trees, the size they are. It's very important to not plant a tree that will get too large in a certain location. And so we've got fact sheets that talk about the mature size and the adaptability, whether they work well in eastern Kansas, central or western Kansas, or all across the state.
Not all trees will fit in there.
Exactly. For example, some of the one species that people like to plant have beautiful red leaves. It's a small, low-growing tree. It's Japanese red maple, but it's really only adapted to the far eastern part of Kansas, and especially if it's in a courtyard or a sheltered location on the eastern edge of the state. It does not like our high temperatures and high winds. We get more exposed sites in central and western Kansas.
Then you think of other examples. Blue spruce, folks like to plant those, and sometimes they'll make it. Oftentimes they can't stand our summers.
Exactly right. The blue spruce, during the establishment phase, people water it frequently, and it looks great. And then after a few years, they wonder what's happened. We had a neighbor of mine that in the high winds, the saturated soils this spring, a couple of blue spruce just blew right over because they tend to have very shallow root systems, and they were 15 feet tall. They had looked quite good, and they just blew over with the high winds and the saturated soils we had.
So ask about the durability of those ornamental trees, and most assuredly understand their susceptibility to certain conditions, and ask many questions of your nursery operator. They can be good sources of information as well.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, you've selected your tree. Now to the planting. How you dig that hole makes a huge amount of difference.
It certainly does. Preparing the hole correctly can help lead that tree to success, allow its root system to expand into the soil. One thing I would mention, if it's going to be a large container-grown tree or a tree spade dug tree, go ahead and dial the 811 number and get your utility lines marked, because if you're digging down even a foot deep, you could be running into a utility line, fiber optic line, or something like that. So we recommend dial the 811 a couple of days before you're going to plan on do that planting, so the crews can come out and check for any utility lines in that area.
That is highly important. The consequences otherwise can be problematic, to say the least. The thought here, though, is you want a large hole proportional to that root ball, right?
Exactly. What you want to do is not dig the hole any deeper than the root ball, but dig it wider, because most of the root growth will be out sideways in the soil, horizontally in the soil. Very little roots will grow down very deep, especially in our heavy clay loam soils. And so you dig a wide hole, maybe twice as big as the pot, but no deeper than the pot, because you don't want it to be settled or planted down into a depression.
All right. Well, we knew, Charlie, in our allotted time today, we weren't going to get through the whole project here, so we want to welcome you back this same time next week and continue talking about properly planting a new landscape tree here in the fall. Until then, many thanks to you.
Thank you.
From the K-State Horticulture and Natural Resources Department, that's Forester Charlie Barden on this week's Horticulture segment. Closing out this Thursday edition. As always, thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.